If you look out on the inner wide web, there are some really odd laws out there, aren't there? If you look up odd laws. I went to a website called dumblaws.com and pulled some of these. It is funny, isn't it? There is a law in Alabama that prohibits drivers from being blindfolded while operating vehicles. That makes sense, doesn't it? There is a law in Juneau, Alaska that says the owners of flamingos can't let their pets in the barbershops. I guess that makes sense. And here's a really good one. There's one in Prescott, Arizona that says no one is permitted to ride their horse up the stairs of the county courthouse. Odd laws often have their roots in something that took place many, many years ago. But the laws are still on the books. Let's take Prescott's law against riding your horse onto the steps of the county courthouse. I suspect that at some time in the distant past, someone did exactly that. And then the city fathers looked for something in the law that would prohibit future incidents. And not finding anything, they created a new law. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's often how laws are made. And once those laws are on the books, they kind of tend to stay there forever, don't they? Of course, it does make sense to have a law like Prescott's. A horse on the courthouse steps would block entry by pedestrians. A horse on the courthouse steps might stumble and fall. And then there's the delicate fact that a horse produces 20 pounds of manure every day. As well as some judges I know. I can say with certainty that a horse is no respecter of the courthouse steps. You know that? So a law prohibiting people from riding their horses up the courthouse steps, it makes quite a lot of sense, doesn't it? Once you stop and think about it. In our gospel lesson today, we find a law with which we are quite familiar, but which nearly no one today obeys, do they? It's the law prohibiting work on the Sabbath. One of the 10 Commandments says, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. You shall labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. You shall not do any work on it, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your livestock, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We get that from Exodus 20. If I were to ask for a show of hands by those who keep the Sabbath law, I would expect not to see many hands, The fact is that few Christians observe the Sabbath, which traditionally falls on Saturday. Nor do most Christians feel constrained to observe Sabbath law on Sundays or any other day. For the most part, we do what we want to do, or what we are required to do on weekends as well as weekdays. But like most laws, the Sabbath law makes good sense if you think about it. It makes sense in two ways. For one thing, Exodus says that God created the law prohibiting work on the Sabbath to honor the fact that God rested on the seventh day. Therefore, God called the Israelites to honor God by keeping the Sabbath holy, by resting on the seventh day. But there's another reason as well. Even though Christians are no longer subject to Old Testament laws, we want to honor God, and we do need rest. In times past, when people observed the Sabbath law, they spent the day at home with their families. They could read or play games, and hopefully someone in the family could play the fiddle or a guitar or piano, and the family would gather around and sing a song or two. It sounds pretty good, doesn't it? We've lost something by ignoring the Sabbath law in that context. Of course, people couldn't refuse to do all work on the Sabbath, especially in rural communities like we live in. Because as you know, cows need milking, don't they? Just as in every other day, they need to be milked on the Sabbath. And sheep require a shepherd's protection every day of the week. And Jesus noted that people were allowed to rescue a sheep that had fallen into a ditch on the Sabbath. And he also said that the same would be true of a child or an ox fell into a well on the Sabbath. And in our gospel lesson, Jesus bumps up against his enemies, the Pharisees, on 2 counts of violating Sabbath law. Now, on the first count, Jesus' disciples had plucked some grain to eat. Plucking grain from someone else's field might sound arsonist, but Torah law, out of the book of Deuteronomy, it specifically allowed it, as long as you didn't use a sickle and harvest too much. And the Pharisees held Jesus responsible for the actions of his disciples. They said, "Look, why are your disciples doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So Jesus, he reminded them of a story with which they would have been quite familiar. And to understand the impact of the story, you must understand that King David was not only Israel's greatest king, but David, he had become an iconic figure, kind of like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. The Pharisees could criticize Jesus, but they didn't dare criticize David. So in the story of David, he wasn't yet king. David and his companions were fleeing from King Saul, who was jealous of David and wanted to see him killed. David and his companions were hungry, so they asked the priest for bread. And the priest protested that the only available bread was the holy bread, which we might liken to the bread that we eat when we do the Lord's Supper. But the priest relented a bit and said that he would give them the holy bread if David's young men had kept themselves from women. And assured that this was the case, the priest gave them the holy bread, and David and his companions ate it. So Jesus concluded the telling of that story by saying, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And the Pharisees, they couldn't think of a response. That's an interesting take on the Sabbath, isn't it? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God intended the Sabbath as a blessing for people. God intended the Sabbath to give people a restful day. We need some restful time, don't we? A few years ago, the magazine Newsweek, it ran a cover on which there was only one word in large bold letters printed. It just said, "exhausted." And the article inside told the stories of people, from the president of Harvard University to single moms, to a father trying to juggle 2 jobs. And all of those people were exhausted. Everyone was exhausted. Can you identify with that? I think we all can at some point in our lives. Is it any better today? I don't think so. While email has blessed us in many ways, I'll use that as an example. Email has broken down the barriers between the workplace and home. For many people, it's as if they never leave work. They keep getting emails at all hours. Emails that demand their attention, require a response, and identify problems that just have to be solved right now. And we're surrounded also by labor-saving devices, aren't we? But we're still just as exhausted. So Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God intended the Sabbath to bless us. The God who created us, he knows that we need rest, doesn't he? And he intended the Sabbath to address that need. God knows that we need time with our families and intended the Sabbath to meet that need. And while we are no longer required to observe Jewish law, we will do well to set limits, to enforce restful time and family time. And I think by doing that, we could probably reduce the number of heart attacks and the number of divorces. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then Jesus went to the synagogue where he encountered a man with a withered hand. And the Pharisees, who had been embarrassed in their first encounter with Jesus, they were eager to just give it another go. So they watched to see if Jesus would heal the man's hand on the Sabbath, so they could accuse him of violating Sabbath law. And Jesus gave them another chance. First, he told the man to stand up. Then he asked the Pharisees, is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do harm? To save a life or to kill? That was well established in Sabbath law. People were permitted to help when life was in danger. They were permitted to help in emergencies. But as far as the Pharisees were concerned, this man's withered hand was no emergency. He'd been like that for years, and he could wait another day until the Sabbath had ended. But Jesus felt differently. And presumably, the man with the withered hand felt differently too. When Jesus told the man to stretch out his hand, he did so. I'm sure that wasn't easy, for a man who had tried for years to hide his disability. He was in a public space, and everybody was watching him. The man, for once, was the center of attention, and something he had always avoided. But he had heard about this Jesus, and he was willing to take a bit of a risk so that he might have a chance to be healed. And so he stretched out his hand. And the Bible tells us, it says, and his hand was restored as healthy as the other. And then it tells us that the Pharisees, having been trumped twice by Jesus, they huddled together with the Herodians to figure out a way to destroy Jesus and to kill him. What do these two stories mean for us today? For one thing, these stories, they tell us that God created the Sabbath for us, for each and every one of us, to give us a restful day, a family day. God knew that we needed rest, and that our families need us to be present with them. That's a pretty good takeaway from these stories. And for another thing, we need to pay attention when Jesus asks, is it lawful on a Sabbath day to do good or to do harm? To save a life or to kill? In God's economy, it's always lawful to do good, to help someone in need, to rescue someone in danger, and it's always lawful to save a life. It's always lawful to help. But there's a third takeaway also from this. And it's one that we already know deep in our heart. It's that Jesus Christ is our Lord. And he will bless those who trust in him. As the man with the withered hand trusted Jesus when he stretched out his hand, that doesn't mean that Jesus will always do what we want, does it? It does mean that Jesus is in command, and he will bless those who trust in him. Jesus is Lord. He is the Lord of those who trust him, and he's also the Lord of those who don't trust him. The Pharisees didn't trust him, but he demonstrated his mastery and his lordship. He demonstrated those things to them anyway. But the one who trusted was the one who received a blessing. So let us trust in Jesus. Let us allow Jesus to bless us.